Hello and welcome to the History of the Germans, episode 227, Landsknechte versus Swiss Mercenaries, the Swabian or Swiss War of 1499. Why are the Swiss called the Swiss? After all, Schwyz is only one of 26 cantons and not one of the largest ones. How did the proud and prosperous citizens of Zurich or Berne, mighty city-states in their own right, decide they wanted to be named after a mountainous region largely inhabited by peasants tending to their gorgeous brown cattle, the Braunvieh? They even called their national airline Swissair until my former colleagues at McKinsey let the air out of that one. So, why Swiss? The answer goes back to today's topic, a war that the Swiss call the Schwabenkreig or Swabian War. This war played a massive role in Swiss historiography, and its main battles at the Caven and at Dornach were mentioned in the same breath as Morgarten and Sempach. It was seen as the moment when Switzerland de facto exited the Holy Roman Empire and began ploughing its own furrow in European history. Meanwhile in Germany, this war that we call the Schweizerkreig or Swiss War is largely forgotten amongst the hundreds of other military conflicts. It was also the first of many contests between two formidable fighting forces of the Renaissance, the Swiss Reisläufer and the German Landsknechte. These soldiers of fortune have percolated the national consciousness on both sides, their fanciful dress depicted in art on both sides of the Rhine and still providing one of Rome's most Instagrammable photo opportunities. And on top of that, we have the usual incompetence and skullduggery that should be incentive enough to listen to this episode. But before we start, let me remind you that this show is advertising free thanks to the generosity of its patrons. And I have decided to reduce the number of times I do these little sections at the beginning to only every second episode. Trust me, I do not really like doing them, and I guess you do not always enjoy hearing them. But they are weirdly effective. So, if you want to make sure that we can continue with fewer or even completely disappearing requests, you can go to historyofthegermans.com/support and make a generous contribution, such as the ones that Stephen L., Tomislav Z, Inka O, Janet S, Kate FH, GH, and Christian T have already done. And with that, back to the show. Now, the first thing to say about this war is that nobody wanted it, least of all our friend, the still only king of the Romans, Maximilian. As we heard last week, the great Habsburg had made himself the butt of all jokes in Europe when his grand plan to crush the king of France literally sank to the bottom of the sea in the Bay of Livorno. He was politically almost completely isolated at this point. The former members of the Holy League had one by one made peace with the new king of France, Louis XII. First Spain, then Venice shook hands with their former enemy in the hope to make some gains in Naples and Lombardy. The Pope was bribed with the promise of a principality for his eldest son, the notorious Cesare Borgia. The biggest setback for Maximilian was, however, the first of those peace treaties, the one that his son Philip the Handsome, the ruler of the Netherlands, had signed with King Louis XII on July 20th, 1498. That deal was made whilst Maximilian was actually still fighting on his son's behalf for the Duchy of Burgundy. It was a true stab in the back, and Maximilian would forever complain about his son's lack of backbone. All that meant that Maximilian's last remaining ally was Duke Ludovico Sforza, Il Moro, the Duke of Milan. These two guys now clung to each other like two drowning men hoping to survive the wreckage. And the new King of France was just about to drive his speedboat right over them. Louis XII was the grandson of Valentina Visconti, of the Visconti family, who had once ruled Milan before the Sforza had replaced them. And that was enough for him to claim the enormously wealthy duchy for himself. He took one look at the handsome Philip and decided that irrespective of the latter's wealthy lands and increasingly greater prospects to become the King of Spain, that he was not the most threatening of men. If he could keep him calm, then Louis thought he would have his back free to go down to Italy. Which is precisely why Maximilian was so upset about Philip the Handsome's deal with Louis XII. Maximilian still came up to see his son and his new wife Juana of Spain, and he professed his delight at their joyous union and the imminent prospect of offspring. He even started another campaign against the Duchy of Gelders, that was a still rebellious part of the Netherlands, as a way to convince Philip that a more assertive stance against the French was affordable. But Philip and his advisers, as well as the Estates General, remained unimpressed. They would not stop Louis XII from going down to Milan. And that meant Maximilian's friend, the Duke of Milan's time, was running out fast, very fast. King Louis XII of France had a personal badge and a royal beast, and that was the porcupine. A largely nocturnal rodent with a coat of sharp spines or quills. He decorated his castles, paintings, tapestries, coins, liveries, and manuscripts with images of porcupines. They were a symbol of both defense and aggression, since people at the time believed porcupines could shoot quills at adversaries. Despite this lack of understanding of the animal's anatomy or the importance of biscuit tins when it comes to porcupines, it was still the most suitable sigil of the times, because a porcupine's back looked very much like the squares or haufen of masked pikemen that dominated the battlefields of Europe in around 1500. And this brilliant segue gets us now closer to today's subjects. The Swiss mercenaries or Reichsläufer played an important role in this political equation. French military doctrine had focused very much on a standing cavalry army. Infantry had been seen as cannon fodder by the French aristocrats throughout the 100 Years' War, and was hence always recruited as mercenaries. As the 15th century progressed, infantry had continuously risen in military importance, until they had now become absolutely crucial. And by 1499, Europe's most revered mercenary troops were the Swiss. Their success in the battles at Granson, Morgarten, and Nancy against what was then believed to be the greatest military force in Europe, that's Charles the Bold's army, that had made sure of that. Episode 215, if you want to check back. Hence, what Louis XII needed for his Italian campaign was access to Swiss mercenaries. And in turn, Maximilian wanted to prevent exactly that. Now, the hiring of Swiss army contingents was a well-regulated process. Most cantons maintained a militia, who were trained in the unique fighting style of the Swiss Gewalthaufen, the pike squares. They had their officers and petty officers and members of the militia, and they all owned their own necessary equipment, namely a pike or halberd, some swords, knives, and some pieces of armor. They were in effect ready-made regiments able to be deployed within literally just a few weeks. These regiments could, however, only be hired from the canton administration, be they the alderman, the city council, or occasionally even a bishop or abbot. There were, however, restrictions on these contracts, namely that these contingents could not be used to fight other Swiss contingents, and that they could be recalled at any time if their homeland was in danger. These conditions then meant that over time the Swiss lined up with one side in any of the major conflicts, and given the largest conflict at the turn of the 15th century were the Italian Wars, the decision of the cantons who to send their militia to was going to be decisive. And then this decision was not just a function of money. Sure, these are mercenaries, but if it had really only been about money, then the King of France would have always had first dibs. But on occasion, the eternally skinned Maximilian was able to recruit Swiss contingents. The canton's political authorities would take into account non-monetary benefits, like the opportunity to extend their territory or long-standing political alliances. Allegiance to the emperor and ancient feudal obligations even played a role. So making a deal with the French was not a given from the start. Maximilian had been cultivating friendly relationships with the Swiss Confederacy. One of his first acts after he had been elected King of the Romans was to confirm the generous peace treaty his uncle Sigismund of Tyrol had signed. And throughout the build-up of his grand plan, he had encouraged his allies, in particular Ludovico il Moro, to hire the Swiss, even when the Swiss signed a contract with King Louis XII in 1498, whereby the French were given exclusive access to Swiss mercenaries in exchange for a generous pension that was paid irrespective of actual deployment. Maximilian still kept being super friendly, hoping things may turn around at some later stage. Now, Maximilian may be doing a lot of schmoozing, but how warm and fuzzy did the Swiss really feel about him, his family, the Habsburgs in general, and the empire more broadly? Now, historically, the Habsburgs had been the arch enemy of the Confederacy. As we heard in episodes 150 and 205, this unique political structure had actually been created specifically to defy the Habsburgs. It was not so long ago that Friedrich III had brought the Armagnacs in to end this abomination, as he had called them. But more recently, Sigismund of Tyrol had joined the Swiss in their war against Charles the Bald, that's episode 214, and a perpetual peace had been signed and then confirmed by both sides. But from a Swiss perspective, there were still some serious long-term issues here. When Maximilian married Marie of Burgundy, the two traditional opponents of the Confederacy, the Habsburgs and Burgundy, had joined forces. Sure, the Low Countries were now exhausted. The Duchy of Burgundy had gone to France, and Maximilian was perennially broke. But thinking long-term, this could still become a very uncomfortable situation. Moreover, Maximilian's closest ally was Milan, the Swiss's neighbor to the south. That makes a firm alliance with Maximilian and his family and friends a worrying consideration. Nothing imminently problematic, but the Swiss, they think long term. And there was a political move that had irritated the Swiss further, and that was the formation of the Swabian League, the Schwäbische Bund. This association was founded by Friedrich III in 1488, mainly as a counterweight to the Wittelsbach expansion and as a tool to recover the Tyrol and then for Austria, as we discussed in episode 221. But it did still irritate the Swiss. The Swabian League pooled together the fragmented political entities on their northern border, the various counts and imperial knights of Swabia, as well as cities like Konstanz, Ulm, Lindau, Ravensburg and Rottweil. Now, previously, some of these places, or some of these cities, had shown interest in becoming what was called zugewandte Orte, a sort of associated member of the Swiss Confederacy. But by creating the Swabian League, that kind of expansion of the Confederacy was essentially blocked. And then, even more recently, the Empire had agreed the reform package that included the ewige Landfrieden, the Reichstag, the Reichskammergericht, and the common penny that we discussed in episodes 223 to 225. The Swiss were and understood themselves to be part of the Holy Roman Empire. Zurich, Berne, and others were free imperial cities, the rural cantons, estates of the empire. There were bishops and abbots here who also enjoyed some immediacy. But these new imperial institutions were a headache. For one, they did offer no benefit to them. The Confederacy had already successfully eradicated feuding. There were courts and enforcement mechanisms in place that were widely accepted. Decision-making in the Tagsatzung, the annual gathering of the cantons, was much more effective and much more egalitarian than the Reichstag. Taxation on canton level existed and proceeds were deployed as prudently as they are now. Raising an additional tax to fund a court system that interfered with their existing structures was not popular. And it became even more unpopular when the Reichskammergericht in one of its earliest decisions imposed the imperial ban on St. Gallen and Appenzell. But then what caused the biggest rift was something that Maximilian was actually responsible for. The Swiss, with their peculiar provisions that they would not fight other Swiss, had left a huge gap in the market for mercenary forces. Say, if the Swiss turned you down, well, you knew that their pikemen were coming. And that meant now you really needed something equivalent, and quick. Enter stage left, the Landsknechte. They were created exactly out of such desperation by Maximilian in and around 1482, as a way to stand up against the Swiss contingents the King of France was deploying in the War of the Burgundian Succession. Now let me just quickly explain the word Landsknecht. Now there's Knecht, which basically means farmhand or employee or servant. Now the word Knecht had been used to denominate soldiers and mercenary soldiers since the High Middle Ages. But the term Landsknecht per se only appeared in 1486 in a Swiss official document. There they were defined as mercenaries recruited outside the Confederacy. Basically, the term was made to denote that there were the fake ones, much like the Made in Germany label was initially designed as a warning to customers. Much like that, Landsknecht became a successful brand name in its own right. Initially, and up to the period we're talking about right now, the fighting style of Swiss and German mercenaries was largely identical. Maximilian simply copied the style and techniques he had seen either when fighting them or on the few occasions he had been able to hire them. Now, this basic technique consisted in forming a tight square of a few thousand men with pikes and halberds sticking out and then marching relentlessly and fast straight into the enemy's center. It was the speed and the pressure that made them so effective. These guys would literally run uphill or at artillery positions in the belief that rapidly overwhelming the enemy may be costly, but less costly than being shot to pieces down below. Cavalry found it almost impossible to penetrate a wall of pikes that were 4.5 to 5 meters long. Discipline was so highly developed that would on occasion open a path for the enemy cavalry to get inside the square, only to close it again behind them and have the guys with the halberds dragging the riders off their horses and massacre them. Now it was that cohesion and discipline, as well as their refusal to give any quarter, that got enemy forces to run even before any contact was made. As I said, Maximilian tried to get his own infantrymen to copy these techniques, and he did achieve some success here, namely at the Battle of Terouanne against Louis XI, and then on several other occasions. And he massively elevated the social standing of his infantrymen. In a world that was used to revere the armed men on horseback, you may remember that when Maximilian entered Ghent in triumph, he and his senior officers walked with their pikemen on foot, rather than riding alongside them. And as we go into the very end of the 15th century, the Landsknecht had already gained a solid reputation and had turned into serious competition, which the Swiss Reisläufer did not like one bit. While their tactics were very similar in the beginning, there were a number of fundamental differences, though, between the Swiss and the Landsknechte beyond the place where they were recruited. The Swiss soldiers were part of a militia that was trained to defend their home canton. That meant they were usually fighting alongside their friends and family, and the motivation was in part pay, but also there was a big element of honor of the community. As mentioned before, the militia was raised, organized, and administered by the leadership of the canton, who were also the ones who agreed the contracts with their foreign customers. The Landsknechte, on the other hand, were individual soldiers who were recruited ad hoc by an obrist, an oberst, or a colonel. Now, this colonel was a war entrepreneur who raised and operated his forces solely for compensation. His recruits were professional soldiers who were also entirely coin-operated. This fundamental difference in the recruitment process drove a number of further differences between the two forces. Now, the Swiss were known as the more disciplined force. They did, of course, loot and pillage, but within some set of rules. They were less prone to general rowdiness and uncontrolled behavior, largely because the members of the regiment all knew each other and would return back to their hometowns and villages. And though, obviously, what happens on campaign stays on campaign, bits and bobs one might not want everyone to know about tended to seep through the local gossip mill. The Landsknechte, on the other hand, were hired ad hoc and from a wide range of places, meaning there was a lot less social control. Basically, nobody would tell your mum what you did at the sack of Rome in 1527 because nobody knew who your mum was. This lack of coherence amongst the Landsknechte then required them to have an even more draconic discipline in the camps and during campaign. Punishments were famously harsh and often imposed not by the officers but by their fellow comrades. The most famous of those punishments was the Spießrutenlauf, or running the gauntlet, that dealt with really accusations of particularly serious crimes that had tarnished the honor of the entire mercenary company or the regiment. Responsibility for justice was shared, so one of the officers acted as the provost, as the public prosecutor, but the actual judges were the mercenaries themselves. The mercenary community appointed 3 juries, which each independently recommended a verdict which could be either acquittal, pardon, or death. The provost would lay out the case for the prosecution. The accused could then protest his innocence or beg for mercy. Now, if the mercenary advocated the death sentence, they proceeded to the place of execution and formed a corridor in an east-west direction, with the pikemen lining up on either side in 2 tightly closed rows of 3. If a pike bearer left a gap to allow the condemned man to escape, he was threatened with having to run through the lane in place of the delinquent. At the end of the lane stood the ensigns with their flags lowered in disgrace. The condemned man had to confess before his comrades and forgive them for their judgment. Accompanied by the provost, the poor man now walked through the lane 3 times to bid farewell to his comrades and ask their forgiveness for his shameful deed. Then the ensigns rolled up the flags and stuck them upside down into the ground. The provost struck the sinner 3 times on the shoulder, and the condemned man entered the alley and marched towards the flags. So in this case, the judges and the executioners were the Landsknechte themselves, who punished the disgraceful deed with their spears and thus restored the honor of the flag. A pretty gruesome punishment for men used to committing acts of almost unspeakable violence and bravery. Both the Swiss and the Landsknechte were professional soldiers, and in the 16th century that was an honorable profession, even if one fought for money rather than for king and country. It required skill and a certain amount of wealth. Soldiers were expected to bring their own equipment, their pikes, swords, knives, armor, and helmet. Hence, the lowest classes were rarely able to join the regiments. In particular, in the early days, the ranks of the Landsknechte were made up of the sons of prosperous farmers and burghers, even lower nobility, who may have had a sense of adventure and were given the kit as a way to pay them out of their inheritance. The Swiss tended to be from more modest, occasionally peasant backgrounds. Mercenary work had been a family tradition in many of the Alpine valleys going back to the early 14th century, when Emperor Henry VII relied on them for his journey to Rome. Hence arms and armor could be handed down from father to son rather than having to buy it anew. Pay differed too. The Swiss, thanks to their stronger brand name, offer of exclusivity, and richer patrons, were paid more, usually between 4 and 6 gulden per month, whilst the common Landsknechte were paid just 4 gulden. However, about 10 to 20% of the Landsknechte were in something called double pay, aka 8 gulden per month. These were men who had special expensive equipment like firearms or double-handed swords, and took the most exposed positions in the front and the corners of the fighting square. Now this looked like very generous pay. A labourer or journeyman would earn probably about 1 to 2 gulden a month, meaning the soldiers started on more than double the pay of a labourer, which could go up to 8 times and then even multiples of that when they were elected into officer rank. However, work tended to be seasonal, i.e. the regiments were usually dissolved after campaign season had ended, so that on a per-year basis the average Landsknecht wasn't necessarily that much better off. Though the pay level for the Landsknechte was lower than the Swiss, that did not show. If the Swiss Reisläufer dressed for war as fight, the Landsknecht dressed for war as spectacle. The signature feature was slashing, the deliberate cutting of outer garments to allow billowing puffs or contrasting fabrics beneath to push through. Applied to doublets, hose, sleeves and caps with what can only be described as evangelical enthusiasm, slashing transformed the Landsknechte into something resembling a very angry and well-armed piñata. The effect was achieved by men who were, let us remember, professional killers, and who apparently saw no contradiction between disemboweling their enemies at dawn and spending the previous evening carefully translating their mood boards into wearable fashion statements. The puffed and padded hose deserved special mention, great ballooning garments of slashed velvet and silk that made the wearer's legs look like a pair of prize-winning marrows and prominently displayed their codpiece. Combined with a broad flat bonnet adorned with extravagant feathers, the overall silhouette suggested less of a hardened veteran of the Italian wars than a Dubai influencer with a pike. This was not, however, mere vanity, or rather it was exactly mere vanity, but with a legal justification attached. Maximilian had granted the Landsknechte an explicit exemption from sumptuary laws, the regulations that normally restricted ostentatious dress to the nobility, as compensation for the exceptional dangers of their profession. The Landsknechte took this exemption and ran with it at considerable speed, dressing in a manner that suggested they intended to extract maximum value from every moment they have left before a Swiss halberd settled the matter permanently. The Katzbalger, their distinctive short broadsword with its S-shaped guard, was worn with studied nonchalance at the hip, a nicely lethal counterpoint to all the silk and feathers above it. It was perhaps the one element of the Landsknecht ensemble that needed no embellishment to make its point. In a way, these differences between the more sober Swiss army attire and the Landsknecht bling reflected an even deeper social rift between the members of the Swiss Confederacy and their southern German neighbors. By the end of the 15th century, Swiss society had become comparatively egalitarian. There were no princes or mighty counts here. The nobles that did exist had become vassals of the major cities or had joined their ranks as patricians, and peasants had a much higher standing here than they had anywhere else. Meanwhile, the opposite shore of the Rhine was dominated by the Habsburgs, the Dukes of Württemberg and the Markgrafs of Baden, as well as the dozens and dozens of counts and imperial knights who happened to be free agents only subject to the emperor. The patricians in the major cities in Konstanz, Ulm, Lindau, Ravensburg and Rottweil copied the habits and clothing of the nobility. The lower classes aspired to be part of this upper echelon, which is one of the reasons the Landsknecht attire was so appealing. They looked down on the Swiss, in particular those from the rural cantons in central Switzerland, as peasants, devoid of any nobility. And as the rift deepened, the two sides began calling each other names. The Germans referred to the Confederates as Kuhschweizer, cow Swiss, pointing out their rural roots, their lack of sophistication, and insinuating unnatural attachments. In return, the Swiss called their neighbors Sauschwaben, literally sow Swabians, meaning roughly the same, only dirtier. All these differences, the clothing, the social structures, the competition for military commissions, the imposition of imperial courts and taxes, the encirclement by the Habsburg lands and allies, the creation of the Swabian League, and the deep-rooted antipathy to the Habsburgs left the border region a loaded howitzer waiting for the casual drop of a fuse. And so, though nobody really wanted a war started in January 1499. One of Maximilian's advisors, the banker Georg Gossenbrot, had been attacked and mistreated by what he claimed had been the Swiss. In response, Tyrolean troops occupied the Abbey of Munster, a property disputed between the canton of Graubünden and the Habsburgs. That triggered a call for help from Graubünden to the whole Swiss Confederacy, at which point Tyrol called on the Swabian League to honor their alliance. Bells rang, calling men to arms. The Landsknechte boasted that they would scorch and burn the Swiss lands, so that the Lord himself on his rainbow would have to pull in his feet to get away from the heat. Graubünden alone raised a force of 12,000 men who attacked along the border between Lake Constance and Arlberg. They declared it a böser Krieg, an ugly war, where no quarter was to be given, all prisoners to be killed, no ransom to be collected. Soon after, the war engulfed the other leg of the border along the Rhine between Constance and Basel. The administrators in Innsbruck, who had triggered all this chaos, now wrote to Maximilian and called for him to abandon his campaign in Gelders and come south ASAP. Maximilian called on the imperial estates to raise an army to fend off this attack by uncouth peasants and received the usual response: deafening silence. Meanwhile, the Landsknechte suffered one defeat after another, at Hart on Lake Constance in February 1499, in Bruderholz near Basel in March, and in April in Schwaderloh, where even the artillery fell into the hands of the Swiss. A particularly awful skirmish happened near Feldkirch, where a combined force of Swabian and Tyroleans was driven into the river Ill by a smaller Swiss contingent. 3,000 men drowned, no quarter given. All these fanciful dressed dudes had to show for themselves more some large-scale cattle rustling and raiding. People started to say that these Swabian colonels were more suited to be highwaymen than soldiers. Parts of the local peasant population on the border were encouraged to raise up, hoping to join the Swiss in their commoner's paradise. When Maximilian finally got to Lake Constance, he once again lent on his friend Ludovico il Moro to help him out with money and material that he could ill afford. The army Maximilian gathered and led against the Graubündner was wiped out at the battle on the Caven. 2,000 armed riders refused to come to the aid of the Tyrolean infantry. They simply ran away. Another 4,000 men lay dead, and the lands on the borders were devastated for a generation. In revenge, Maximilian sent his men to do the one thing they seemed to be able to: rustle 10,000 kettles from the Engadine, making sure their people would suffer from hunger too. Meanwhile, some sort of imperial army had finally gathered in Swabia, but their commanders refused to engage. The soldiers collected berries and enjoyed the sunshine before going home without having thrust their sword even once. The whole thing turned into even more of a farce than the actions before Livorno. One Swabian noble was, however, hell-bent on taking action. Heinrich von Fürstenberg gathered a couple of thousand men and besieged the fortress of Dornach near Solothurn. But his force was undisciplined and failed to put up sentries. A Swiss army appeared on their back, rolled them up, and cut them down. Another 3,500 dead, including Heinrich von Fürstenberg. No quarter given. Now that was it for the military side. Plus, King Louis XII of France had now become, unsurprisingly, the Swiss canton's preferred client and had marched his army into the Duchy of Milan, where he was intending to oust Maximilian's friend Ludovico il Moro. So Maximilian was open to agree terms. And these terms boiled down to, depending on viewpoint, an awful lot or nothing at all. There were no territorial concessions, and Switzerland remained part of the Holy Roman Empire. A few years later, Basel and Schaffhausen joined the Confederacy, but they were the last ones. Attempts to bring in Konstanz, Rottweil, Strasbourg or Colmar were abandoned. In fact, the border, as set around that time, had remained the border between Switzerland and Germany to this day. On the other hand, Switzerland was kept out of the authority of the Reichskammergericht, had no representation but also no obligations to the Reichstag. The Swiss did not have to pay the common penny and were left out of the Reichsmatrikel. So, for practical purposes, they had left the Holy Roman Empire, a fact that was only formalized in 1648 at the end of the 30 Years' War. The other thing they took away from this war was their name, the Swiss. The term Schwyzer or Swiss had circulated in the neighboring regions for a while already, namely since the Battle of Morgarten in 1315, where the men from Schwyz played an important role. But the various cantons preferred the term Eidgenossen, oath fellows, which made sense since, for instance, Berne was much larger and too had an extremely distinguished military tradition. In fact, the term Swiss was often used by the supporters of the Habsburgs as an insult, suggesting they were all simple peasants. And in the Swabian War, that then turned into the derogatory term Kuhschweizer, cow Swiss, with that added suggestion of bestiality. So no wonder the Eidgenossen reacted ferociously whenever they heard anybody call them cow Swiss. But after the war, where they had comprehensively trousered or actually de-trousered their opponents, they began to use the term back at their enemies, in a sort of who is mooing now sort of a way. It then slowly became a positive term, reminding them of their great victories at Morgarten, Sempach, and now Caven and Dornach. Around the same time, the foundation myths of Wilhelm Tell and Andreas Winkelried took hold, forging a national identity that in the common parlance then turned into the Swiss. Though the official name of the country is Confederatio Helvetica, abbreviated as CH, a fancy Latinized term going back to a Germanic tribe from the time of the ancient Romans. Okay, so much for the term Swiss. But what about the Landsknechte? Now, this defeat was catastrophic in the extreme. The Swiss forces had cut through their imitators, not even like butter, more like goat's cheese or yogurt. But they did contain the source of their recovery within their organizational setup. As you may remember, the fundamental difference between the two forces was that the Swiss were at heart a local militia, trained and managed by their cantons, whilst the Landsknechte were fighting as an ad hoc army under the command of a war entrepreneur. So the Swiss cantons coordinated their training, tactics and deployment between each other to ensure that their customers received a consistent quality of service. So that made them very coherent, but it at the same time slowed them down when it came to the response to technical innovations. Now, the war entrepreneurs, who were based mostly in southern Germany, the Götz von Berlichingens, the Franz von Sickingen, Ulrich von Huttens, and Georg Frundsberg, they had no need or interest to coordinate their activities. In fact, the opposite. They competed with each other for business, encouraging themselves to constantly innovate. So it was the Landsknechte that adopted the double-handed sword, that introduced heavier firearms like the arquebus, quicker and in larger numbers. They were also prepared to coordinate closer with cavalry and artillery in combined arms operations. This was a slow process of trial and error, but as we will see, the devastating defeats in the Swabian aka Swiss War of 1499 did not repeat. So next week we will finally march across the great threshold into the 16th century. I announced that several weeks ago, thinking it was imminent, but as usual, I got distracted. But this time, it will definitely happen, I promise. After all, we have to accompany our friend Maximilian to one final humiliation in his favorite imperial city in Augsburg, and I hope you will come along. And remember, if you want to keep me in a slashed double and prominent codpiece, all you have to do is go to historyofthegermans.com/support, where many options to express your generosity and fashion sense await you.